back. Now we're going to begin our learning in Vayikra. This is actually going to be Vayikra chapter 1. We're going to be going over the subject of Korbanot. Korbanot are offerings, sacrifices. And we're going to hit a lot of the problems, misconceptions, lack of understandings of Korbanot. And we're also going to focus on the importance, the meaning, and the subject behind Korbanot. Many times people think that because of hearing about offerings, the Korban as we're going to refer to it throughout this whole lesson, is they think that, sacrifices took away sin. Okay? And the answer goes to say is, no, it never took away sin. Why is it never took away sin? Let's go back and really think about the logic behind this attitude. If sacrifices took away sin, well, don't you think sacrifice would have been initiated from the very beginning? And the thing is, we don't see sacrifices being initiated from the beginning. Matter of fact, what we do see is we see in Bereshit that right after Adam and Chava are kicked out of the garden, that the Torah talks about the sacrifice that took place and an offering that took place, as it says in chapter 4 of Genesis, Vihi miketz yamim, and it was at the end of days, Vayavo, Cain, that Cain came mipri ha'adamah, from the fruit of the ground, Mincha la'Adonai, as an offering to the Lord. V'havel hevi gamhu, a havel also he brought, mi bachorot, from the first fruits, tzono, of the firstling, tzono of his flock, mi chelevehim, and from their fats, the fattest of, V'isha Adonai el havel, and the Lord regarded havel, ve'el minchanto, and unto his offering, ve'el Cain, but unto Cain, ve'el minchato, and unto his offering, lo sha'ah, he did not regard, v'yichar, and he was angry, la-Cain, towards Cain, ma'od, exceedingly, v'yifulu panav, and his face fell. So we find that Cain became very sorrowful because of the fact of realizing the fact that his offering was not being accepted. Now we see here in this passage here that when it talks about Havel, it talks about Havel bringing of the fat of his lambs and the best of his flock, the firstling of his flock. And Cain, he only brings from the fruit of the ground. And he doesn't even bring the best, he brings whatever he wants to. Okay? And this begins the first time we actually hear of any kind of offering or sacrifice of any sort being mentioned. And then after we go forward, we only find randomly, during certain events, a burnt offering being offered, but no sacrifice of sin, no sacrifice of any sort, other than just a simple burnt offering that's mentioned in certain random points in time. And we begin to sit here and be thinking, well, if sacrifices took away sin, why would God leave all of the generations in the past to be stuck not having an atonement? Because that's what you'd be thinking. If they didn't have the sacrifices back then how would they atoned? Okay? This goes to show you that sacrifices did not physically take away sin, but actually sacrifices were instituted to teach about how sin is removed and how sin is being wiped away, atoned for. Okay? And this is why at Mount Sinai we find that sacrifices are only obligated upon Am Yisrael, the children of Israel, literally meaning those who are the Mosaic covenant, because Gentiles were not required to bring an actual korban, a sacrifice for sin, any way, shape, or form. Okay? And this is what we're going to be focusing on in this lesson to really understand Korbanot and what the Korbanot are about and how to understand the Korbanot and to really grasp the meaning of Korbanot in its fullness. So with that being said, let's begin in prayer. Lord, I really pray Adonai over our home. I pray over our lives. I pray help us to fight against Satan's lies. Help us to stand against the wickedness that the enemy tries to plague against our world. Help us to fight to stand firm in truth and holiness. Help us to be strong and vigilant in the word. And help us to stay strong in the commandments and the statutes that we would know to follow, to keep, and to stand in agreement with and obedience to the words of Torah. Help us to stand against evil. Help us to fight against iniquity. And help us to stay far away from sin, that we would walk in the ways of truth. Amen. So, when we look at the issue of Korbanot, right, we have to really grasp and understand what is the purpose of Korbanot. Okay, because, how people are presented the New Testament is so perverted. They don't understand Korbanot. They don't understand the meaning of Korbanot. They don't understand the subjects of Korbanot. If you go and you've watched the video that I did about Yom Kippur, we find that on Yom Kippur, both the Ezrak and the Ger are being atoned on Yom Kippur. And how this is accomplished is the Kohen HaGadol is the one who actually offers the the goat and the bull. He offers the bull for himself and for his household, and he offers the goat on behalf of all of the people, which would refer to both Jews and Gentiles, and that the goat that's being sacrificed and killed and offered up to the Lord, that this is on behalf of all those who believe. And then at the end, the scapegoat, that's what we call it many times, also known as the goat that goes to Azazel, that perishes and is cast over the cliff and dies to its death, who has the crimson red placed upon it, that this goat, all of the sins of Israel and all the sins of the world are placed upon this goat, and this goat is cast and thrown off to its death. And we find that in the time period of Yom Kippur, this teaches that the whole world at this point is being atoned and forgiven for. And so we're learning about the understanding that this is what Paul was referring to when he says, without there being a sacrifice for sin, there is no atonement. There has to be a sacrifice, there has to be an atonement, and he's wanting us to understand the picture of what the Torah is saying is something is being killed on behalf of us, on behalf of the world, and on behalf of anyone who out there believes, and that when this thing is killed, that its death is bringing about a covering and atonement for sin. And this is why it's important that we can completely destroy all the lies of the false Jewish beliefs that are being propagated out there. When people say, well, Jesus is not a sin sacrifice, well, Jesus is not, no, God doesn't command us to go around killing people and stuff. All of these accusations are just ridiculously messed up and made up lies and how they're creating it. Okay? The Torah is making us understand to know that a lamb is a picture of something that is put to death. It's killed on behalf of those whom have the sin, and the sin is being poured upon this specific animal. Now notice this is only dying for the one of whom the atonement is going to be provided for. So the person slaughtering the animal is not connected to the person offering the animal. You got to understand this and make this very clear to your understanding here, okay? Somebody is slaughtering the animal on behalf of the one who's offering the animal, okay? And so we see the picture here that when the animal is being slaughtered, we're seeing one is being acted as the one that kills the animal, while the other one's being acted as the one that's receiving the atonement for when the animal is killed, okay? Which represents the picture that we're supposed to be understanding here. Mashiach, he represents the Lamb. We, as the people, represent those who believe, of whom the Lamb, Mashiach Yeshua, is being slain for our sins. But who is slaying the actual Lamb is not the one who's offering the lamb, okay? He's offering the lamb on behalf, as we learn, so we understand this, that ultimately, all of us, in some way, shape, or form, we are responsible for the death of the lamb, We all know. Anyone who believes, they understand this, that all are responsible for the death of the lamb. Because the lamb couldn't be brought, the lamb couldn't be offered unless there was something wrong. So we see that this is the picture the Torah wants us to see, is that we've done wrong, and this is why this even had to happen, is the fact of why Messiah was even crucified, was because of the wrong that was committed by anybody in the world who believes. Okay? And the Torah tells us here that when it comes to the issue of the sacrifice, okay, we have to separate sacrifice from the concept of what we're learning here with regard to murder, to understand the fact that sacrifice is obviously the ritual of taking something and slaughtering it and offering it onto the altar. Okay? That's what a sacrifice is. The Torah tells us that, and this is why Paul even tells us that the things that we learn in the scriptures are actual pictures of things that are deeper in the reality of what we physically see. That means they mean more than what we're just looking at. So the sacrifice, which is a ritual, is a picture of something being killed, and that through the death of this lamb that's being killed, atonement is being received. And that when the lamb is being killed, that blood that's being spilled and shed is causing that person to be given the opportunity to be given forgiveness. And then the lamb is bearing the iniquity and the sin of that person, and ultimately the lamb is dying because that person is placed his iniquity that he committed on that lamb, of which God is allowing the lamb to perish for the behalf of the person to be forgiven and for the person to be considered, whole and complete again. And so the Bible really wants us to realize and understand and see the fact that Mashiach Yahushua being murdered is exactly the picture of the lamb being slaughtered. The lamb being slaughtered is a ritual. Mashiach being murdered is the actual physical picture of what was represented by the actual slaughtering. And then, of course, the person receiving the atonement represents the believers who receive atonement because of faith in God's promise that He would provide atonement. Therefore, we know that lambs don't actually take away sin. Lambs are only a physical example that represents the greater picture. The real picture, the real event that actually causes sin to be forgiven. Okay? And then we have the issue of the fact of when people when they try to sit there and say, well, God doesn't cause us to go and take human beings and slaughter them. That never was the issue. That never was the picture. The picture wasn't about somebody's going to be offered on an altar and they're going to be slaughtered on the altar, and then all of a sudden, poof, that person becomes the atonement. That never was the picture. See, the Bible even talks about saying the earth is the altar. God even talks about this in the scriptures. So we know that Messiah, by His being murdered, and by being murdered here on this earth, His blood, which was spilled and it was poured upon the earth, acts as the same thing that was taking place when the lamb who was slaughtered, the blood being poured on the actual altar, which goes to show the fact that that was the meaning of that picture that being presented there. And then, of course, afterwards we receive atonement. And so we find that really never was atonement achieved by the physical sacrifice system. It never was achieved that way. How was atonement achieved? It was the faith in God's promise. That's how we received atonement. It was the achievement through our faith in believing that God is going to forgive us and that He is forgiving us, and that by doing this physical act, we are seeing atonement is how it was applied through the death of the Lamb. And this is what we see here. And so the Torah begins by saying, Vayikra el Moshe, and God called, and He called unto Moshe, Vaydeber Adonai, and the Lord spoke alav unto him, Meohel Moed, from the tent of meeting Lamor, saying, Deber el ben Israel, speak unto the children of Israel, Va'amarta, and you shall say aleihim unto them, Adam, ki ikariv michem karban, a man, when he will draw near from you, a korban, an offering, okay, a sacrifice. Ladonai, to the Lord. Min ha-behema, from the animals. Min ha-bakar, from the cattle. min hatzaon, and from the flock. So notice how he says min ha-behema. Min ha-behema. Behema is just a generic noun for animals. And now we go to hearing the generalization becoming a specification. Because he says min ha-behema, and then he says min ha-bakar or min hatzaon, we now have the specification. So the generalization was the animals, which makes me think that at this moment, if it was just from the animals, you might have thought from the wild animals, I can use a deer, I can use a gazelle, I can use a giraffe, and then we can use these for sacrifices. Then the Torah specifies here, min ha-bakar. Now we're not talking about wild animals. We're talking about domesticated animals that come from the cattle. These are cows. Okay? And then it says min hatzaon, and from the flocks. Now we're talking another specification where it says min hatzaon. These only refer to animals that are among sheep and goats, because those are the only things that we have for flocks. Then it says takarivu, you shall cause to draw near et karbanechem, your offering. So yours, plural, he's talking about. So if any person wants to come, this is what he has to do. But here's the question we have to find out is, what person is this relationship to? The answer is only Jews. Only Jews and converts who are connected to the Mosaic covenant are required to do this actual physical act. And they only can do this act when there's a physical temple. So the temple, for example, Jews are not sinning because they're not sacrificing, because the Torah says the temple has to be allowed to be built for these instances to exist. So the Torah has actually given us an important understanding of this, because we find, and I'm actually going to move forward for a second here to kind of throw this point out. When we go to the passage that deals in chapter 17 of Vayikra, Vayikra tells us that only at the Ohel Moed are we supposed to bring any kind of offering. And therefore we know from Vayikra chapter 17 that only the offerings can be brought to Ohel Moed, and the Ohel Moed can only be the place where sacrifices are performed. We know that from here, the logic understanding is that we are only allowed to bring the sacrifices to the actual physical temple itself. So if the temple is not standing, I'm not sinning. Because if I cannot build the temple, that means God has withheld the ability for this to be. Not so that we can be, made guilty of any sort. God's not saying we're guilty because we didn't bring a sacrifice. He's telling us that by this not existing, these applications of these specific commandments do not apply. So really we're learning something very special from the Torah, and that is what? That under certain circumstances, which is, if such an event takes place where such a thing does not exist, the application of these commandments then therefore do not exist until a circumstances arise by which these applications are reinstated. Okay? So let's think about this from a standpoint that we can really relate to and that really understand. Okay? If the world was not sinning, which means everyone was keeping the Torah and everyone had been atoned for, they've been resurrected from the dead, there is no sin for in the world anymore, would anybody bring a sacrifice to the temple? The answer is no. Nobody would bring a sacrifice to the temple, because the sacrifice to the temple would require that some wrong be committed, besides the fact of a vow offering and besides the fact of a peace offering. And even then, because of the issue of what the Torah teaches about Olam Haba, because animals will not be killed in Olam Haba, even those things will come to an end. But it doesn't mean that the sacrifices of peace offerings and thanksgiving offerings won't. I mean, you could still physically bring a sacrifice, but it's not a sacrifice that is physical. It's a sacrifice that is based upon your physical actions that show thanksgiving and that show the love and hope that you have. And those are the things that we do. For example, right now, such as like when we fast. Okay, when we fast and stuff, we are actually offering God a sacrifice of thanksgiving when we're fasting over things that we're thankful for what had happened and stuff. And granted, in the world to come, there will not be any fasting because nobody's going to be sad and nobody's going to be worried about things and stuff. And we find that literally the time period when we think about Thanksgiving and stuff, it's really going to be the obedience of the Torah. Our obedience to the Torah is our showing God thanks. So the sacrifices will be spiritual in the world to come, where the sacrifices here are physical. Okay? So when we have, for example, no more sin, there is no need to bring sacrifices. Therefore, the temple system stops. Not because you're stopping it, not because you're taking swords and shields and you're trying to stop people from going to the temple. No, it's stopping based upon its inability to have a need to exist. There is no longer a necessity for the existence of these things to exist. Because as long as sin is not at all existing, there is no longer a need for the sacrifices to exist as well. Just as there would no longer need to be a commandment that curses someone for doing wrong if no one in the world is sinning. It's just not applicable. Curses only exist if there's people who rebel, right? So if people are not rebelling and are not transgressing, there's no need for these things to even exist. And Mashiach tells us this very clearly through his words. What does he say? He says, "Not till heaven and earth pass away shall one dot or tittle pass from the law." So we know that once the world has been reformed and retransformed and we're in the time period called the world to come, none of these things will have any change. The Torah is going to remain as it is today until all of these events have transpired. So we know that from everything that we're learning, that you cannot take away any of these needed aspects here, nor can you hold people in a sense of accountability like you're sinning if you have no physical ability to do such. You cannot force Jews to build a temple when Arabs are wanting to make nothing happen. I mean, it just doesn't work. That's like trying to, force a group of people to sell bread when every night they're being robbed from, and you're trying to say, you have to pay them bread. Like, we don't have any bread. We have no bread whatsoever. You're trying to force us to sell something we don't have. All right? And this is where a lot of Christians have messed up everything, okay? Where they try to place blame upon the Jewish people to say, well, see, you don't have a temple, and yet there's no logic for their reasoning. Because the reasoning would have to be, if I have the ability to build the temple, I have nothing restraining me from building the temple, and I'm getting able to build the temple, well then we'll build the temple, right? But if I have something restraining me from stopping me from keeping me from doing it, I have no obligation to build it until these situations are cleared up and fixed. Okay? So the temple service in itself, that's why we have to think logically. We have to think very logically when we look at the Torah. Why would God initiate a sacrifice system which took almost, we have to think about this, almost 3,000 years just to come into being? So for almost 3,000 years, not one Jew was sacrificing and offering for sin. How did he deal with sin in the past? That goes to say he had to know and believe that God is the one who forgives and that atonement is applied, but he had to learn from something. And where did he learn that from? The burnt offering. Knowing the fact that the burnt offering was the first thing we ever see ever being offered, it was a picture of the remembrance of God giving us the hope of redemption and forgiveness. Knowing that the sacrifice that used to be given was the burnt offering. The burnt offering was a picture of something dying, something being given up, and that a picture of this is what happens. Sin destroys and corrupts people. It has to be dealt with. It has to be atoned. But we don't see the concept of the sin sacrifice initiated until some 3,000 years later. So all the Jews in the past and all the people in the past that we read in the scriptures, from Adam all the way up to the time before Moses receives this Torah commandment in the wilderness, we see how were Jews referred to when they created mistakes and they did errors. They all knew Yom Kippur, which Yom Kippur, by the way, was not initiated in the wilderness. It always existed throughout history. So Yom Kippur was always a day of fasting. It was always a day of asking God and praying for God's atonement. By getting the service of Yom Kippur, by seeing the lambs that are sacrificed during the mincha offerings of the Tamid, we begin to see this understanding of atonement being given at a greater point of view by seeing the two goats that are being offered and the bull that's being offered during Yom Kippur. We see another physical example of atonement being given. And we see that the picture that's presented to us as we learn about the offerings of Yom Kippur, we learn that Yom Kippur went from a time period of praying and fasting and seeking for God for forgiveness to a service that is, in addition to the praying and fasting that was done, is now being done in the tabernacle, where this tabernacle is being used as a platform for these events to transpire. A goat's being offered for La'azazel, a goat's being offered for La'adonai, a bull's being offered for the Kohen and for his household, and then of course the atonement that's made for all of the people, both the Izrach and the Ger. And from the standpoint, we begin to realize that all of these things that happen, just like Passover. Just like when we look at Passover, Passover was always an event that was held and observed by every single person from Adam all the way until the time of Moses. The application of Passover got altered as God added more observances to Passover. It went from remembering our going forth out of Egypt, remembering that we're going to be redeemed, it's a time of redemption, it's a time of salvation, to now we have a sacrifice that has to be offered, it's got to be put in the tabernacle, the blood has to be spilled on the altar, the lamb has to be roasted, and so all these additives are added to what is known as the Mosaic Covenant. So we see that everything we find that has to do with the Mosaic Covenant always brings us back to this temple service. So that as the temple's being used as this stage of, in a sense, it's almost like, I don't want to degrade it in any way, shape, or form, but it's almost like watching a show, watching a play. You're watching these events being done, and each of the things that are done and displaying in front of everybody is a big oath, okay? Each of these things is an oath. Why is the lamb being slaughtered? Why is the blood being poured here? Why is this being done? All of these things are otiot. And these otiot were meant for us to say, whoa, this is meaning this. This is referring to this. It's the same thing we find with Moshe. When Moshe goes and he takes the staff, he sticks the staff on the ground and it becomes a serpent. That staff becoming a serpent was an oath. There was a demonstration done before the people to represent the greater purpose and idea of what it was referring to. We learned that the oath of the serpent the staff becoming a serpent, was to teach us that the people had taught and led their idealisms of teaching the Torah in such a destructive way that instead of using the staff to help guide them and keep their walk steady, they were thrusting the Torah down to the ground, which was now attacking the people and making the people flee because of the fact they were turning God's Torah into something that now was going to judge them rather than keep them steady and strong and to help them move in their walk. And so we find that these are the wonderful things we learn from the Torah, is the fact that the Korbanot, they represent the otiot. These are the signs that are being done inside the tabernacle. And they were meant only for the time period that God allowed these things to be done. God doesn't have to have the tabernacle existing forever and ever and every day, these things happening. His purpose and his plan for why he allowed it to happen this time period, and why he allowed the tabernacle to get destroyed, and what happened here, and why he let the tabernacle get destroyed again, we begin to start looking deeper into the film of looking at it, that really, does God want me to go to the tabernacle and bring sacrifices and burnt offerings? The prophet says, this is not what God taught you in the wilderness. It was not to spend your days going to the tabernacle and bringing sacrifices for sin. The point of the sacrifices was to teach you to stop sinning. It was making the point of saying how many lambs need to be killed on your behalf before you get the point that this is not really a good thing. I'll never forget when I was a kid, and I'll never forget this one time that, we had this big gopher problem in the backyard. And I thought, hey, we need to get rid of these gophers. They're digging in the backyard, so I'll just do what I was taught growing up. Use a gopher trap, and you put it in there, and bada bing, bada boom, you got your gophers, and they're dead, right? It wasn't until one day I went to search out the gopher trap to see what had happened. And there I found the gopher. There he was, absolutely stuck in this trap, but I realized the trap didn't kill him. It pinched him. And I was too afraid of getting bitten by this gopher because I did not know how to get this gopher out of the trap. Because all it did was it just kind of wrapped around its skin and squeezed it, and it kept it trapped so it couldn't move. But where my hand, if I was to try to get this gopher out of it, I was too afraid of getting bitten by this thing, and who knows what could have happened at that moment. And I came up with an idea of well, he stays like this, he's just going to starve. And I can't let that happen because that to me is just cruel, okay? And I thought, well, I'll just kill it. And so I took a stick and I beat it on the head, and then I saw the squirrel die. And it was at that moment when I saw the the gopher. I said squirrel, aren't that? Gopher, squirrel, right, anyways. It was at that moment when I saw the gopher was dead. It actually hit me so hard, I couldn't bear it for a moment. Because I realized how awful it was to actually physically see an animal die right in front of your face. And it was at that moment I began to really see the fact of, this is what Adam must have felt when he saw the skins being taken from an animal that died and perished because of him perishing, and him getting that point of realizing that this was a horrible thing that took place. And I began to even think about the sacrifices and how a person must have felt when they saw the lamb being slaughtered and being used as a sin sacrifice. And I was like, this makes a lot of sense. Death is horrible. It's a horrible thing to see an animal die because of you. And when I sat there and I realized that, what? I told myself I wish I never put a trap out there in the beginning now. Now I realize and stuff that this is what happens. I mean, the reality of a dead animal actually really set in hard for me. And I even cried over it because it really bothered me. Because I realized I was the reason that this poor little gopher got killed. And it really made me realize and see the fact of the reality of life in many, many ways. And I made to sit there and think about the fact of, why would I want to go to the tabernacle and say, oops, I sinned again. Oh, here's another lamb. Oops, I sinned again. Well, here's another lamb. And I realized and stuff that, what? The point of the tabernacle was to stop. It was supposed to turn away from sin. And that the ideology that we find that Mashiach Yehoshua teaches us is the fact that Mashiach Yehoshua teaches us that his dying for our sins is not destroying the tabernacle and the sacrifices, because people have turned it in as to say, well, he's the real sacrifice, therefore he stops all the sacrifices from being offered. When in fact, that's Antichrist teaching. That's a false teaching of people saying this. Okay? Because Jesus cannot take away the sacrifices that are in the temple. You got to understand this. The sacrifices leads us to Messiah. The sacrifices were done as an oath to lead us to the understanding of what Messiah's done. How many times do people sin in the world during their life? And you're going to say, well, yeah, it happens. I've committed sin, a lot of times in my life, right? And we have to realize this. Well, then, what would happen if the temple was standing? If the temple was standing, you would be, if you were Jewish or part of the covenant, you would be going to the tabernacle, or the temple, and you'd be offering a sacrifice for the sin of that specific thing that the Torah requires because of your transgressing. And when you offered it, you're reminded, this is what Jesus did for me. He died for my sins. I don't want to come back to the tabernacle and see a lamb slaughtered over and over and over again. I want to stop this stupid struggle that I've had with whatchamacallit, or whatever it is. And that's what Messiah does. He turns us away from sin to show us the reality. What is the sin doing? First, it's destroying our lives. It's screwing us up. And secondary, Messiah had to die in order for that sin to get wiped away. Messiah had to die in order for that sin to be forgiven. And we begin to realize and stuff that the more we understand that, the more we're seeking, I don't want to sin anymore. And the more Messiah is helping us to walk in obedience. And you see, when people try to say, well, Jesus died and he does away with all our sins, they're changing the dynamics as if to say, see, God's laws are done away with now because Jesus died. And then understanding that, no, if God's law leads me to Messiah, leads me to see Messiah in everything if the temple is standing right now, then that means my goal after seeing the death of the Lamb would show me, Avi, don't do this anymore. Don't get caught up in this stupid thinking that you did. Don't fall in that trap that you did. Because you didn't like seeing that lamb killed, did you? No, I didn't. I did not like seeing that. And it reminded me of the reality of what Messiah did for me. And therefore my heart's to be turned away from sin. And therefore even John says that we sin no more if we walk in obedience. If we're keeping God's commandments, then we are not sinning because we're seeking obedience. It's only because of disobedience that we sin. That's the only thing we find. And therefore, you look at the reality, we live in a world where everyone at some point has sinned or is sinning at some point in things in their life because of whatever circumstances. Whatever it, maybe you lost your temper at the wrong moment and you flipped out and you said things you shouldn't have said, or maybe it's the fact that you accidentally violated Shabbat when you did such and such and you weren't even thinking. I mean, all of these things are part of what creates sin, correct? They are. So the understanding, the reality is, when we look at what even Paul says in the book of Hebrews, he tells us that if the sacrifices actually took away sin, then it would have ceased to be offered. It would have done it. It would have made the man perfect right then and there. But see, sacrifices don't make you perfect. Sacrifices only represent the greater. That is, it represents what Jesus is. Represent what Jesus did. So, how do you stop sacrifices from existing? Stop sinning. That's how the sacrifices come to an end. Stop sinning. Stop violating the Sabbath. Stop, committing adultery. Stop, whatever it is that is the transgression. That's how the sacrifices come to an end, is we cease from the sin. And we can only stop through Jesus Christ, our Lord and Savior. He's the only one that can help us keep the law and walk in it. That's why even the Bible tells us in the book of Acts that God's Spirit is in those who obey Him. So to walk in the Spirit means to keep the law, to obey what the law says, to observe and do what the law teaches. And when we walk in the Spirit, we're walking in accordance to an obedient lifestyle. So we have to understand the Korbanot and really understand the otiot that's done here to get a grasping understanding of why all these things had to happen and why these things exist the way they exist, to understand this in a proper perspective. Because woe to those people when the temple stands and people start flipping out thinking, oh, you're trampling the blood of Christ by bringing an actual sacrifice of sin. You are going to be seriously blaspheming the Torah. Because Jesus' sacrifice, as if you listen to what I'm saying carefully, it's the cessation of sin. That means his goal is to get us stopping sinning. That's his goal. And if you look at all the righteous men in the scriptures, one thing you will find in common, every righteous man, at points in their life, they stumbled and made mistakes. But one thing is for certain, they lived their life seeking obedience. And that is what God is trying to get us to do, is walk in obedience. God doesn't expect us to be perfect. We would have to get out of these bodies. We'd have to no longer ever struggle with sin to have a perfect, complete, 100% lifestyle. You look at Moshe. Did Moshe make mistakes? Here he was. He's man, filled with the God's Spirit, filled with God's Holy Spirit. And yet he made his own mistakes at times. Because we are always going to be fighting that demonic realm as long as we live and breathe in this fleshly body. Satan's always going to somehow try to attack us. And he uses whatever tricks he can to try to come against us. And God knows that. That's why God is fighting vehemently for our soul. And he wants us to vehemently seek out his word to know how we are to live and keep. So that we can walk in righteous living, walk in righteous attitudes, and stand in opposition to the enemy. And as God elevates the Kedusha of us in our lives, he's helping break off all of the tags the enemy's placed against us so that they're broken off of us. That's why even Paul says that God is going to complete our salvation when? At the resurrection. That's when we're going to be made complete. Where we're not going to struggle with that sin desire, that sin struggle that tries to pull at us. Just like it said in the Bible, its drive is at you, its desires for you, it crouches at the door, but you must what? Rule over it. So we're learning how to rule over the enemy by learning how to be obedient to Mashiach Yehoshua. And by being obedient, we have to learn also to understand what obedience is and why we need to understand these things. What mental changes do I need to make to put my mind in congruence to what his will says? Because when I understand the Korbanot, I'm learning more about myself. Who am I? What kind of a person am I supposed to be? What does my mentality need to be? How can I change these thoughts? How can I become better in the way I function? So he says here as we go on to learn about the Korbanot, it says, Im olah Korbanot, if an olah, burnt offering, is his korban, is his offering. Min habakar, from the bakar, the cattle. Zachar, tamim, a male that is perfect. So tamim, what does tamim really mean? Tamim really means absolutely functional, all right? That means that when you would to slaughter the animal, the healthiness of the animal on the inside expresses the same healthiness you see on the outside, okay? It doesn't have warts, it doesn't have lacerations, it doesn't have infections, it doesn't have funky, weird, nail disorders. This animal is beautiful on the outside as well as is on the inside. And so that's what tamim we're looking at in here. Yikarivun, he shall cause to draw near, el petach ohem moed, to the entrance of the tent of meeting. Notice this. Why is it we're required to bring the sacrifice to the tent of meeting? This is really an interesting thing because we begin to see the fact of what is this all about. Notice that God is requiring us to go as Jews and as converts, that we have to go to the tent of meeting to present this sacrifice. And the answer goes to say, because what? Maybe I want to look at it from my own perspective and say, hey, that lamb's good enough. That bull's good enough. I think this is perfect. Here, we're bringing it to somebody else to inspect, right? So we're not inspectors of ourselves. The Torah tells us we're to have others inspect us, because we're going to be too soft on ourselves. You understand? We might go like, yeah, that was good. I like that. That was great. But see, the korban is brought to what? The Kohen, as the Torah is going to say here. El petach moed v'yikarev oto shall draw near letzano according to his will lifnei Adonai before the Lord. V'samach yado he shall place his hand al rosh upon the head Allah of the olah. V'niyatzah lo lekaper alav, and it shall be accepted for him to atone upon him. V'shechad et ben habakar, shall slaughter the ben habakar, the animal. So the ben bakar, the young cow, shall be slaughtered, lifnei Adonai before the Lord. He kirvu b'nei Aharon, and the sons of Aaron shall draw near hakohanim, the priest, et hadam, the blood, v'zarku, and they shall toss et dam, the blood, al hamitzbeach, upon the altar saviv around. Asher petach omer, which is at the entrance of the tent of meeting. So here the thing is, the Korbanot actually requires the kohanim to be a part of this actual service here. They're the ones inspecting it. They're the ones examining whether or not this korban is sufficient. Is it good? Okay? And so the Torah goes to say here, it says, Hivshit, and Hivshit, he shall relay at the olah, the burnt offering, nitach ota, and he shall chop it, lin tacheha, in its pieces. So they're supposed to chop it into its certain pieces. V'natznu b'nei Aharon, and Aaron, the sons of Aaron, shall give hakohanim eish al hamizbeach, fire upon the altar. So they're supposed to put fire on the altar. V'aruchu eitzim al ha'eish, and they shall arrange the wood upon the fire. So the fire is these burning embers of coal. You don't have flames, right? So the word eish in Hebrew doesn't actually physically mean a flame, just so you know that. And you can see that because I dare you, put pieces of wood on a flame and tell me what will happen. Very simple. The flame is going to go out, right? It is. Because it's not a flame. It's something that is burning. So that means these are embers of coal that are going to be used as the source of heat that will ignite the wood, and therefore the wood will then burn because of this being ignited this way. So it says, V'aruchu b'nei Aharon, and the sons of Aaron shall arrange hakohanim, the priest, et na tachim, the pieces that have been cut up, et harosh, the head, et hapeder, the fat, et ha'itzim, and the bones, asher al ha'esh, that are upon the fire, asher al hamitzbeach, that's upon, the wood, which is upon the fire, which is upon the mitzbeach. So they're going to take the head, they're going to take the peder, the fat, and they're going to take the wood and they're going to put it upon the fire. So this is the burning embers of coal, asher al mitzbeach, which is upon the altar. V'kirbo, and he shall draw near it a karav, and its legs. These legs are the leaping parts. That's what they're called, karaim. These are the things that leap. So this is this part of the leg. If you were to think about it, it's the muscle part of the leg that gives it all the movement. V'chatz b'mayim, and they shall wash in water. V'hiktir hakohen, and the kohen shall cause to go up and smoke it, kol hamitzbeach, all of the mitzbeach. Olah, the burnt offering, ishe reach nechoach, a fiery offering, a sweet savoring smell, Adonai, to the Lord. Now notice this, it's interesting, it says he's to wash the legs. Why is he washing the legs? Washing the leg represents that the action has been changed. Because your walking is the way that you live your life, is the way you keep. And so by washing the legs represents the fact that the action has been changed of the person who's offering this animal. Okay? And this is so important to understand, is the fact that here's the Kohanim, they're going to be inspecting it. They're going to see if there's defects, if there's issues in it. And when they see there is no defects in it, then the person's allowed to offer it on behalf of the meaning of what the burnt offering is specifically being used for. It says, if from the flock, Korbanot is his offering, min ha-kivisim from the lambs, or min ha-ezim from the goats, la'olah for a burnt offering, zechar tamim, a male that is tamim, perfect, without blemish, yikarvunu, they shall draw near, cause to draw near, v'shechat oton shall slaughter it, al yerech, ha-mitzbeach, he shall cause to slaughter it by the side of the altar, Zafona of the north, Lifnei Adonai before the Lord, V'zarku b'nei Aharon HaKohanim, and Aaron, the sons of Aaron the Kohanim, shall toss et damot's blood al ha-mitzbeach upon the altar, saviv around. V'nitach oto, and they shall chop it, lintacha, for its pieces, ve'ed rosho, and its head, ve'ed pidro, and its fat, arech, they shall arrange hakohen otam them al ha'etzim. So this pired, this fat is actually the visceral fat. This is that nasty fat that you should never touch nor eat. Well, you can touch it, but when you're taking it out of the animal. But this is the fat that you're not allowed to eat whatsoever. And interesting enough, this is the fat that actually all of the animals' toxins go into this fat. And this is the stuff that's the junk of the animal. So this is why it's like the Torah forbids this fat to be eaten whatsoever. It's this really nasty fat. It's it looks almost kind of like a you could say it like in a strange way. It's almost like a creamy cheesy slash like stringy with holes fat in it, like the way the tissue is. Because there's different types that you can see on it, like if you were to open up the actual animal itself, you'll see that it's like, it's almost kind of like, I want to explain it, like if you were to take mozzarella and think about how mozzarella is, like really stretchy, but imagine all these little holes and stuff that are also in it, and then there's other elements that kind of look more like a kind of a cream, like not a cream cheese, but more of like a cottage cheese kind of a look to it and stuff. And so that's what that the pidro is, okay? That's that fat. Ve'erech hakohen, and the kohen shall arrange otam them al ha'etzim, upon the wood, asher al ha'esh, that's upon the fire, asher al ha'mitzbeach. So when we go back, notice that the things that are mentioned here is this. First, it's the head that's offered, that's used for the actual burnt offering. The secondly we find that's mentioned here is the Torah mentions the issue of the visceral fat, or this fat that we find that's called the pared, which is that fat that, it covers the actual organs, it covers the actual lining of different major parts of the organs, like the kidneys and stuff. And then the Torah says that you're to place it upon the etzim, the wood. All right. What do these two things represent if we think about these burnt offerings? Number one, the head is where all the problems come about. It's the thinking, it's the brain, it's the mentality of the person, of where all of these things, whether it's a thought process that came into being, an attitude, an idea that comes into mind, or whatever. The head is the thing we see being offered. Then we see this fat, all right? And this fat, which is this forbidden fat that you're not allowed to eat, this fat represents the garbage that's inside the actual animal. Both of these things is what comes from the fact of when an animal eats something, right? And that digestive process is working, and then whatever the bad stuff that's in this animal, it's being pushed over into these areas of this fat, and that's that toxic fat that, it's not edible. It's not meant for food at all. It represents the garbage that's coming out of the animal, okay? So when we look at this, it begins to really goes to show the fact that God is wanting us to understand it's the head and the garbage that's in of us that he's trying to get rid of. Get rid of this garbage. Get rid of the mindsets. And the Torah goes to say, as we continue on, it says, V'al ha'etzim upon the wood, v'asher al ha'esh upon the fire, asher al ha'mitzbeach, which is upon the altar. V'akerev ha'karim, and he shall, and the innards and the legs, yerachatz b'mayim, he shall wash in water. V'hikeriv, he shall draw near hakohen, el hakol, all of these. V'hiktir ha'mitzbeach, and he shall cause to go up on the smoke. So why are the innards, right? And why is the legs being used to go up and smoke that's being used in this fire? Because it didn't mention this here when it talked about the actual cattle. It mentions it here talking about the kevis. So we know that the cattle also has to have the same applications as well. When we look at the fact of what the innards, what is the innards? The innards represents the stuff that's been used as your intestines. This is the stuff that's absorbing that food that you've eaten, right? The stomach, the intestines, okay? And he talks about the karaim, the legs are also being used in this burnt offering, okay? So when we look at these things, he's saying the legs represent the bad actions that need to be destroyed. The bad walk, the bad way of living needs to be completely destroyed, all right? And then of course, the stomach and the things that absorb all of the different things, like, the liver's used. The liver is a great organ that gets rid of the toxins and stuff. We learn that a lot of these things, when we focus on, it's really about getting rid of all of the bad things that were associated to the problems. Associated to all of the problems that led to the fact of why this guy was even bringing an offering, period. So we have to get rid of this stuff. We really have to work on getting rid of this stuff and getting it out of our lives. And as the Torah continues on to say, it says, Ala kitir, it says, and all of it shall be brought up in smoke, hamitzbeach upon the altar. Olahu, it's a burnt offering, it is. Isher reach nechoach, a sweet savoring smell, Adonai, to the Lord. So God considers that, as we see here, that everything has to be offered for God to consider us acceptable. And we look at this. Think about it. How can we sit here and ever think, for example, that the sacrifice does away with the law? This is the ridiculous part that you really want to see this. Because if you look at the sacrifice, for the sacrifice to be accepted, the person has to have changed. Right? So if the sacrifice represents that a person has changed, he's now doing the right thing. You see how stupid it is to say Jesus did away with the law? Because the law, it shows me that I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing. It's what guides and governs where I'm at in my actions. Okay? If someone says, well, Jesus died, now I don't have to keep the law, then that sacrifice does not make any sense. Because the sacrifice is offered because there is change. Not because the person just wants to be forgiven. Notice there's a big difference within that. Anybody can say they want to be forgiven, but notice the Bible talks about forgiveness is given because there is change. The person's turned away from the sin, showing God that he's sorry for what he did. He's going to the temple to bring a sacrifice for atonement. And after he brings the sacrifice, notice when they open up the lamb, they're realizing this lamb is completely pure, which means the guy has changed. The actions of what he did, he's changed his mindset, he's altered his way of thinking. He realized, I don't want to do this anymore, or I'm not going to do that again, and he's changed. And therefore, the forgiveness is the atonement that covers the lack. So that means when we're looking at Jesus, right, we have to look at him correctly. We have to realize this, okay? He's what causes us to enter heaven. because he is the righteousness that we're receiving because we're willing to change. You cannot receive Jesus if you're not willing to change. He will not be a sacrifice for those who refuse to change. That's why we have to realize this, that he says, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whomsoever will what? Believe. That means you have to change. You have to be a part of that changing process. Will not perish, but have everlasting life. So we know from the fact of what we're seeing here, the sacrifices show us and begin to teach us that change is all about how this is even being accepted. Sure, you could have a perfectly fine lamb, but it's not going to be given to a guy who's not wanting to do right. See, people think if I can find a perfect lamb, then God will just forgive me. But that's not how it works. God won't give you a lamb that's pure if you're not pure. He will not give you a lamb that is unblemished if you're blemished. He's not going to. That's why it had to be brought to the Kohanim and they inspected to see what's going on with you. Because if they see, we got a problem here. Their attitude was, they would go back and tell you, sweetheart, God wants you to change. You need to do teshuvah in this area. Because your sacrifices was not acceptable. That was to give the person the idea of, oh, sheepers, okay. I need to go back and fix this problem. Now when he comes back a second time, and he goes to bring a lamb, that lamb is going to be accepted because they're going to find that the lamb has all the requirements for acceptable sacrifice. And see, this is the perverted understanding that you have with people, is people think that they can have a lamb that's perfect and yet go ahead and live an unchanged life. You have to be changed. That's how the lamb is accepted, is that you've changed and that the lamb represents the atonement that's coming upon you because you've been willing to change. That's why when you look at, for example, that we know historically, that during the time period after Mashiach had died and resurrected and ascended into heaven, the Bible, the history tells us that the Kohanim who offered the Yom Kippur offering from that point forward all the way until 70 AD, that the sacrifice was no longer accepted. Why? Because what was happening was the rejection of what Messiah did, the rejection of what Messiah taught, the rejection of what Messiah was showing them, was showing that every time they wanted to accept everything but Jesus, to accept everything they wanted to but what Mashiach said and what Mashiach was teaching, God was like, no, you're not going to be accepted. You cannot have a sacrifice and get away with what you're doing and yet rejecting the things you should be accepting. That's why it was pasul over and over and over and over again. And see, Christian theologians and all those other teachers out there that don't know what they're talking about, they perverted to say, see, God rejected the temple, God rejected Israel, and see, that's why the temple was destroyed, and therefore we don't have to keep God's laws anymore. They're perverting the whole message. They're perverting the whole reason as to why the temple was destroyed. The temple was destroyed for God to basically say, okay, time out. You guys need to do some thinking. I'm going to let the temple get destroyed. I'm going to scatter you all over the place. You need to rethink what's going on with your lives. And that's what God did. He allowed the Romans to come in. He allowed the temple to get destroyed. And he put all the Jews all throughout the world scattered to rethink what really happened. And that's why for almost 2,000 years, the gospel message has been being preached throughout every generation. until finally the point's going to come where God's going to say, okay, now it's time for all the things to come about so that the redemption of Israel can be restored. Because God, He couldn't just allow the third temple to come at any time and any point, because the Bible tells us that the prophecy is the Antichrist only is going to come during the third temple when it is built. That's why the third temple could not have been built earlier, could not be built right after the temple was destroyed the second time, that it had to be elongated in order to allow people to rethink things. Because sacrifices and burnt offerings, remember, they do not physically take away sin. It's only a picture, it's an otiot of what the reality is that's behind it. It's just like Shabbat. Shabbat is just an otiot of the reality of what's really behind Shabbat. Shabbat is going to be a time of our being elevated in holiness. Our being given the word into our heart and into our soul to the point where it is an elevation of righteousness in the world. A time of God ceasing from all this work that He's done for 6,000 years to get man to do teshuvah and to repent, so that now He can rest with those who believe. That's what the Bible tells us. That all of these things we're doing are signs and symbols with the things that we're supposed to understand. And the more and more we seek to observe the Torah and seek to understand the Torah, the more we're going to understand why these things are given as a commandment. What was this to teach us, and why is it so important for us to hold on to these things and continue the teaching? So he goes on to say, "Ve'im min ha'of," and if from the fowl, olah is a burnt offering, Korbanot is offering, la'adonai to the Lord, he kariv min ha'turim, he shall draw near from the turim, or min ha'benei yonah. So he's to take the turtle doves or the young pigeons, and Korbanot, his offering. So notice the Torah only allows two types of birds: turtle doves and young pigeons. They're the only two that were permitted here. We don't see turkeys, we don't see chickens, we don't see any other kind of kosher bird being mentioned. He kirvu, he shall draw near, hakohen, el hamizbeach, unto the altar, malak, and he shall sever at rosho, its head. What does it mean to sever its head? It means to cut at the neck, where the head is, and the neck connect. Okay? He ktir hamizbeach, he shall cause to go up and smoke in the mizbeach. V'nimtza, and he shall squeeze damo, its blood, al hakir, upon the side, hamizbeach, of the altar. Hesir, and he shall remove et morato, its crop. So its crop is that internal organ thing that's inside of it. Vunatzakta, and its feathers. V'hishlich otam, and he shall cast them etzel, next to hamizbeach, the altar. Kedema, before el makom, the place hadesha, of the ash. So these are the ashes are placed. Vashisa, and shall tear into two oto it, bakanafav, its wings. Lo yivdil, but he should not completely separate. Hiktir, shall cause to come up and smoke oto it, hakohen, ala mizbeach, the kohen shall cause this to come up and smoke upon the mizbeach, ala etzim, upon the wood, asher al ha'esh, which is on the fire. So noticing the fire is always used as the terminology, but it really means gecholesh, the coals of fire. This is why when the Torah tells us in the book of Shemot, you're not allowed to kindle fire on the Shabbat, it's not referring to a flame, it's referring to anything that creates a heat source. That's why we know that turning lights on that have wire little in coils inside the actual light bulb, that creates ash when you turn the light on, because the actual electricity that flows through these things creates the heat index, which creates the ability for there to be ash. If I was to take a piece of paper and touch it, it would go up in smoke. That's why when we know that we turn on our stove or our oven and the heat coils of the electrical oven turns on, it becomes ash. The same thing with regard to turning your engine on. You turn your engine on, the fire that's combusted in the engine, that's creating ash. So anything that creates the heat index that can cause things to burn is called Eish. Okay? So he says, Veshesa, and turned it to oto kanaf by its wings. Lo yivdil, but it should not separate. Hiktir oto al hakohen hamizbeach. He shall cause to go and smoke the kohen on the altar. Ala eitzim upon the wood, asher ala eish, which is upon the fire. Olahu, a burnt offering it is. Isha reach nechoach, a fire offering, a sweet savoring smell. La Adonai, to the Lord. Notice that God wants exactly as He's prescribed. Only when we do what He prescribes, He calls it a reach nechoach, a sweet savoring smell. Alright? So we have to do the things that are required for teshuvah. In order for teshuvah to be accepted, in order for teshuvah to be acknowledged and to be proven to be sound and true, we have to perform the actions that require us to be given off of this reach nechoach, this sweet savoring smell. So that really goes to show that there's a lot of preparation that we have to do before the Korbanot is actually offered. And when we change our lives, it causes that Korban to be valid for us to be used. You understand? And therefore it's important for us to understand that, that the more closer we understand the Korbanot, the more we also understand the fact of why is it we want to eat kosher meat. Because just as we slaughter the animals according to the Torah law, just are we to slaughter our meat according to Torah law, so that the animal we eat is just as pure as the actions we give off. Because we are what we eat. And we need to make sure that we're doing what's right. I hope you continue to follow me with this lesson as we continually go on to Vayikra. We continually press forward into chapter 2. And we really begin to think more about the issues of the Korbanot and understanding the significance and why is it we need to know about it here, as well as understand it and knowing the applications of it. I'll see you next time.